This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 190 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Do you consider yourself to be a member of the middle class? According to CNBC, as many as 70% of Americans consider themselves to be members of the middle class. But if you consider income as a qualifier, it turns out that only about 50% of Americans actually qualify for membership in the middle class. So what does it actually mean to be middle class, and why do so many Americans want to be a part of its culture? According to historian Jennifer Goliboy, the author of Charleston and the Emergence of Middle Class Culture in the Revolutionary Era, we are not the first Americans to think about middle class culture and why so many Americans want to be a part of it. It turns out that back in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, the people of British North America and the early United States also wanted to be part of the middle class, only they didn't use that term back then. Today, Jenny will lend us her expertise so we can explore the origins of American middle class culture and better understand what it is and why so many Americans have wanted to be a part of it over the course of history. Now, this exploration is going to require a field trip to early Charleston, South Carolina, during which Jenny will reveal how the people in early America defined middle class, information about who could be members of the early American middle class, and details about merchants in early America, the work they performed, and why they were so often members of the early American middle class. But first, don't forget we're meeting up in July. Our first meetup will take place on July 8 in Boston. We'll gather at 10 a.m. right on Boston Common at the corner of Park and Tremont Streets. And then we'll go for a 2-hour walking tour of the city so that we can explore Boston's involvement in the American Revolution. And after we've explored this history, we'll head to one of my favorite spots in the North End for some great Italian food and drink. Plus, we're also going to gather on Saturday, July 21 in Cleveland. Now, I don't yet know where we're going to meet up in Cleveland. I just know it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you're from Cleveland and you have a good idea of where we can meet, send me an email. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. I've listed the times, dates, and links for these meetups right in the show notes and in your Ben Franklin's World app. So please check them out because I'm really looking forward to meeting you. Okay, are you ready for our field trip to early Charleston? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is an independent scholar based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She's a specialist in the history of the early American middle class, and she's edited the book Industrial Revolution, People and Perspectives. Today, she joins us to discuss the roots of middle class culture in America with details from her book, Charleston and the Emergence of Middle Class Culture in the Revolutionary Era. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jennifer Goliboy.
Thanks so much for having me here, Liz.
Well, Jenny, we're really excited to have you here so we can explore the origins of the American middle class. Now, speaking of which, you state in the first pages of your book that we need to rethink the origins of the American middle class. Why is that? Would you tell us about the middle class and how our ideas about it need to be rethought?
So we have a couple of issues here. One is that being middle class is so important to Americans. If you ask Americans, something like 70 to 80% of us say that we're middle class. So obviously this is something important that we should think about. The second issue is that so much of the older scholarship says that the middle class was born in the 19th century. But more recent work has shown that it had its roots much, much earlier. Before people even commonly use the term middle class, you start to see a particular culture developing in the 1600s in the Anglo-American world around the independent trading households, the merchants and shopkeepers and artisans who make their living from the market economy. So what is this culture? If they had a mission statement, I think it's best expressed in a phrase that the people I write about often use to describe the way they were raising their children, to be useful members of society. And when they're talking about being useful, they're talking about being useful in the world of work, sort of Ben Franklin's world values. So this is obviously a pretty broad definition. It shifts over time. And one of the things I'm hoping to talk about today is why that makes it such a long-lived idea.
Was this idea that you could be a useful and productive member of society universal, at least throughout the British North American colonies and early United States? Because when we think about being middle class today, there are just so many people who say they're middle class, but if you were to actually look at their finances, we'd find that they're either too poor or too rich to actually be a part of the middle class. And of course, when we think about the middle class, we also have to think about place, right? Because being middle class depends on the place that you live. So being middle class in an urban area is different from being middle class in a suburban area, is different from being middle class in a rural area. So I guess what I'm really asking here is, was the idea of what it meant to be middle class unified during the colonial and early republic periods?
Yes, it is a really broad idea. And it's one of those things, when we talk about the term middle class, we're often thinking about many different things at the same time. And one of those things is wealth. The way these people were talking about it at the time, the way my merchants were talking about middle class values at the time, it was almost detached from wealth in ways that, will cause problems later. But yeah, when we talk about the term middle class, we should be clear, this is a particular way to define things. There are other ways to define it in terms of income, in terms of cultural power. This is one particular definition that seems to be most useful to describe the culture that was developing at the time.
Now, as your aim was to get at the roots or origins of American middle class culture, you chose to focus on Charleston, South Carolina, and its merchants. And I wonder why. Why Charleston? What made Charleston the most ideal example for your case study and a better case study than, say, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, or even Salem, Massachusetts, and their merchants?
So there are a few reasons for that. One of the ways historians often get into studying something is because they have a question they can't answer. There is an enormous letter collection that has been published by the University of South Carolina of papers of a man named Henry Lawrence. Now, Henry Lawrence was a very important, influential merchant in Charleston, South Carolina, who would later have a pretty big role in the American Revolution. But there's a weird way, if you read these letters, that he always seems to be self-deprecating, a way that kind of surprised me for someone who had this much money and this much apparent political power. For example, he gave his son the advice, "Great men love and esteem those among the inferior classes who confine their manners to proper bounds, a word to the wise." So he's telling his son this, and I just couldn't figure it out. So I thought, this is a class thing. This is something where he perceives himself to be a lower class than these people he is interacting with, his son is interacting with, and so he's intentionally holding himself back in ways that need interrogating. So that was question number one. I was explaining this one particular person and wondered if there were more people like him. The second issue was that because so many people think of ourselves as middle class, so many historians think of ourselves as middle class, and I include myself in this, the tendency is often to think of the middle class as the nice people. or if they weren't being nice, hypocrites, people who were trying to promote a more egalitarian society, people who are trying to promote a more just society, people who are trying to promote a more progressive society, and that's not necessarily the case. So I wanted to write about middle-class people without trying to make them better than they actually were. The people I'm writing about in this book are slave traders, and if not slave traders, people who traffic in plantation-grown goods. And there's sort of a third reason I wanted to write about merchants, and this has less to do with the history of the middle class and more to do with the history of South Carolina. And that is, I had read books about 18th century South Carolina and how it's this sort of economically hard-charging place that's trying to fit in with the British Empire's economic system. And then depictions of Charleston after 1820 and this sort of, it's a slow-moving cotton society where nothing ever changes. And I thought, what happened? What happened to Charleston's economy that made it like this? So again, this is not about the middle class, but it was just an interesting place to study anyway that had some holes in its economic history.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that Henry Laurens kind of felt like he was in this middle-class position, because when I think of Henry Laurens, it's always as a big, wealthy slave trader and plantation owner, as someone who really had a lot of political power. And I never would have guessed that he thought of himself as middle class.
And it is interesting. Why does he always do this? I think it's partly because he thinks he's not a gentleman. He doesn't have the education of a gentleman. Part of it is because of the sector of society he's born into. He's not an aristocrat. And it's sort of sad and embarrassing to see him interact with people he perceives to be of higher social status than himself.
Now, as we mentioned, Henry Laurens was a merchant. And Emily would like to know more about what it meant to be a merchant in early America.
There have been different ways people write about merchants. The definition people tended to use in the 18th and early 19th century was that they were people engaged in overseas trade. There were sort of two ways you could do this as a merchant. You could be working on commission, which was common in South Carolina. Someone would write to you, could you please buy all this cotton for me? I will pay you such and such commission. You could also do it on your own account and risk, export an item with the hope that it will be sold for a profit wherever you're sending it. So that's basically what a merchant does. One of the things that's interesting about them is the real stock in trade is their relationships with other merchants. So they spent an awful lot of time talking in their business letters about what they had in common with the merchants they're writing to as they perceived it, which was a great way to get sort of their sense of how they perceived class.
As you were reading the merchants' letters and considering their views on class, did you find that they always considered themselves to be from the middle class? I mean, it sounds like they had some wealth to invest in their businesses and into their personal connections, so would they have been middle class?
Could you be of elite status and be a merchant? And the answer is not really. You could be extremely wealthy, and many merchants were. Our friend Henry Laurens was, in fact, one of them. However, there are things keeping them from being the highest rank of local society, and that sort of changes over time. In the colonial world, they can't really be elites because they're part of an aristocratic society. And even though the aristocracy is not mostly located in America, it's there as a conceptual ceiling to how they perceive themselves. Once you go past the colonial era, there are other things coming into play, which are probably best talked about once we talk about how the economy changed over time in Charleston.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about the evolution of Charleston's economy. But first, to continue with our exploration of merchants, how exactly did someone become a merchant? You mentioned that Henry Laurens noted that he didn't have a gentleman's education, but surely he must have had an education. I mean, he did grow to be a very successful businessman and planter, as well as a slave trader.
This is a big concern to historians. One of the great reasons to study merchants is because they had uniformly good handwriting, which is not always true for a lot of letter writers. So it's a lovely thing to be able to read their letters, and they're just beautifully clear. So one of the things you have to do is to be able to read and write fluently in English. You also have to have some degree of numeracy to be good at the job as well. They seem to have learned accounting. So how did you learn this sort of thing? It was basically an apprenticeship program. Young men would go work in somebody else's house, and at some point they would have enough skills on their own to be able to set out on their own, to put out a shingle. They would often work in partnerships, but the really important thing about being able to work in somebody else's house, the other really important part of your education, besides being able to read and write fluently, is to have relationships, to be able to build relationships with people all over the world who would see a letter from you and respond to it.
And how exactly did merchants build these relationships that they needed to conduct trade? I mean, I know we sometimes think of colonial America as this really provincial place, but it was actually part of a really large world, especially a really large Atlantic world. And there were people scattered throughout this Atlantic world that they could have traded with. So how did they meet their specific trade partners around the Atlantic?
Well, the thing about merchants is they're actually pretty mobile people. This would actually even increase over time. But they will often start in a house in one part of the world and then come someplace completely different to actually practice as a merchant. And then they would write all their old friends and wherever they'd grown up and say, hey, I am now in business in Charleston. Please send me X. So that's one way you could do it. I was very surprised as I was reading merchants' letters how often parents sent their quite young children to study in places or live in people's homes far, far away from Charleston. And they would often sort of phrase this as, well, living in London is healthier than living in Charleston. But I don't think that was the entire thing. They would often build connections wherever they had been sent. These are unusually mobile people. And as you go into the 19th century, they may be becoming even more mobile. After the Revolution, I saw many people who would spend part of the year in the UK buying goods and then part of the year in the US selling off these goods and buying cotton. So these people would have endlessly wandering lives. But the final thing is, this is a world where you learn how to charm people without ever personally meeting them. That is your stock in trade. You learn how to connect with people entirely over letters. Part of that is your manner, and part of that is what you're offering them.
Given that merchants were such highly mobile people, what did that actually mean for the demographics of a port city? You know, how did the fact that merchants moved in and out of cities all the time impact a place like Charleston?
There is huge, huge turnover, and who are merchants in Charleston over time? So there are basically two ways I looked at the merchants I studied in my book. One was I read every letter I could get my hands on to or from merchants in Charleston, which was basically a matter of visiting libraries all over the place. The other thing I did is I looked through city directories, which were sort of like phone books before telephones, if that makes sense. And I made a pretty huge database of people's names and when they appear in the city directories and when they disappear. And turnover is generally really huge. Part of that had to do with the sort of business that was actually going on in Charleston and who had the skills and the training to be there.
I'd like for us to go back to merchants' education for a moment. Earlier, we talked about Henry Lawrence, and you told us how Lawrence felt like he never had a gentleman's education and therefore could never really be a gentleman. And I wonder if you would talk to us about gentility and the role that it played in merchants' lives, psyches, and even in their trade. Could a merchant acquire gentility? And why did they think that gentility was the key to obtaining and even exercising social and political power, not that their wealth was the key to exercising all of this power?
This is really a colonial thing. The people after the Revolution are much more rambunctious. And in general, in the 18th century British world, and I'm talking big British world, taste is power. Taste shows that you have had an education, a gentleman's education. So how do you display your taste? Well, one way to do it is to have the appropriate kind of consumer goods in your house. One way you do it is proper methods of socialization. Part of it is the way you write. There is a certain sort of wit you're supposed to display in your prose. There's kind of a dark sarcasm to it, a capability for classical allusion. One of the people who's actually very good at this sort of genteel writing style is Ben Franklin. And poor Henry Lawrence, you'll see him trying to write like Ben Franklin again and again, and he's just not as good at it. He doesn't have the wit, he doesn't have the sense of humor, and you just end up thinking, oh, how did they react to this one? He has one son who he's tried to give the most refined and gentlemanly education, and he talks about how the son wants to be a doctor, and he's just horrified, and jokes about how the son wants to be the master of the clyster pipe, which is an enema, and you just wonder how people reacted to that. It was not good.
Now, what about non-white men? Was obtaining a position in the middle class ever really an option for them? Theodore would like to know if Charleston ever developed a community of middle-class African Americans during the colonial, revolutionary, or early republic periods. And he'd also like to know whether it was really possible for non-white men and women to become middle class in early America.
Okay, so this is an interesting question because there is a group of skilled Black artisans living in Charleston before and after the Revolution. And whether they subscribe to the values and self-image I'm talking about here, I am unfortunately not the expert to ask. I wish I could answer this one for him. But one of the things about having a middle class that in some ways worked on self-definition, you said you were middle class and you were, this sort of hides some things. And when you talk about whether there is a Black middle class, you also have to talk about whether the whites in Charleston accepted them as part of the middle class. So my big answer to that is no. And I would talk about two particular things. A surprising number of the merchants I was writing about had Black women as partners and had children with these women. However, they never treated these women as equals. One of the things I should say about the 18th century in general is that marriage does not imply that marital partners were equal. And having children does not imply that all children were treated equally. This was a world where they were much more open to the idea of inequality within a family. So this is an extreme version of this. It's hard to find details about what the relationships of these white male merchants and their Black female partners were like because they were so secretive about these relationships. For example, after the Revolution, there's a man named Adam Tono who is a very wealthy and well-known and well-connected merchant who has a Black partner, and he hides it so much at the time. The only reason we know about this is after he passes away, there is a surprise amount of money granted to the estate, and there's a debate within the people who survived him about who should inherit this money, whether this woman was actually his wife. So there's an incredible secrecy about the way they treat their children. So this is a case where it seems sort of possible that they would treat their children as equals, and it does not happen in any way whatsoever. And in fact, it seems to me often that the men who cared something about what happened to their children did not raise them in Charleston. Honestly, Charleston is a terrible place to live as a Black person. And I want to give you one other example, and this is after the Revolution. This is the Denmark Vesey Rebellion. Denmark Vesey is African American. He is a free Black carpenter. He is one of those other people by his occupation. Seems like he might have possibly been middle class, but his family was not free. He was never able to earn enough money to free his wife and children, and slavery was all around him. Now, this is one of these things historians are still talking about, how close this thing was actually to happening. But he was the central figure in the Denmark Vesey Slave Rebellion of 1822. This rebellion did not actually happen. There were a bunch of arrests before the date that was scheduled, apparently, for this rebellion to happen. And historians are still arguing about the details. What is clear about this is 35 men who were African American were executed because of this rebellion that never actually happened. When you look, on the other hand, at what happened to white loyalists after the revolution, there were not these mass trials and executions. These people were brought back into community as soon as possible. So when you ask if there's a black middle class, I think broadly stated, you have to talk about whether these people were treated as members of the middle class, and the answer is in no way were they. And in fact, Charleston was a terrible, terrible, terrible place to live as an African-American person of any status.
Charleston was a place with great inequality, especially during the colonial period. And I wonder now what this inequality meant for women. Could women be merchants in early Charleston? And I ask because I know in colonial New York, especially during the Dutch period, that there were women who used their own money and their own connections to conduct overseas trade, just as you've described the men of Charleston as doing. So I wonder if Charleston also had a few women merchants.
I saw a couple of women who were merchants in Charleston, and I saw them in the city directories. Unfortunately, I have not been able to see any letters to or from these women, and they were really outliers. So my sense is it was not as likely for women to engage in international trade in Charleston as they were to do elsewhere. However, there were female shopkeepers in Charleston, and there's a historian named Ellen Hartigan O'Connor who's done a lot of work on that issue. I could also talk about the role of women within mercantile families.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too, because earlier you said that being middle class is a lot about self-identity. So how did women identify as middle class? Or I guess I should say, in what ways did they identify as middle class?
So women in mercantile families did believe they had an important role. And their important role was sustaining the network of relationships that made trade possible. One of the sort of fun things I did as working on this project is merchants in the 18th century, for friends they particularly liked, would often send food that their wives had made often, or local produce to their friends overseas. There are some examples, for example, of Henry Lawrence sending turtles to people in Europe. I don't know how well they kept, but there'd be a live turtle on the ship that the poor sea captain would have to take care of all the way to England. But what women did in these relationships is they would make preserves for their special, special friends to indicate they were the special, special friends. And I was able to dig up some recipes, one for pickled peppers and one for preserved pumpkins, kind of a sweet pumpkin relish, and try those out. And they were actually really good. So that's kind of a fun, lighthearted thing that happened. There were also just sort of fostering relationships in other ways. People would bring connections along with their marriages. Women would entertain regularly, business families, and you see a lot of names repeat. We had Mrs. X over to the house, and meanwhile, they're trading with Mr. X. So that kind of thing. What's interesting about this is this all seems like fun stuff to us. I mean, the lighthearted edge. But to the women, it was interesting that they seemed to think it gave them a voice on how business was conducted in their families, and maybe even a bigger voice than we'd think. There was one instance I found with Isabella Hamilton writing her husband, "Hey, I know your friend lost a whole bunch of our money, but they've been our friends for years, and you should try to figure out a way to redeem this guy." And the husband does, and the families remain friends for the rest of their lives. So it's pretty interesting.
We've talked a lot about merchants and middle-class people in Charleston, but we've yet to really explore the economy that they lived and operated in. And that's exactly what we're going to do after we talk about our episode sponsor for a moment, because middle-class identity really did go hand in hand with the economy. Now that summertime is finally upon us, it could be that, like many of us in the Omohundro Institute office, you're looking for good books to read during your summer vacation. So if I may offer you one that we're all talking about, I'd like to offer you the newest OI book publication, Susan Sleeper Smith's Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest, Indian Women of the Ohio River Valley, 1690 to 1792. Now, one of the questions you're always emailing and tweeting me about is, how did everyday people live? Well, Susan Sleeper Smith's book has you covered, because it will take you through the everyday lives of the Wabash people and how they built prosperous agrarian village communities in the Ohio River Valley. The Wabash communities are really fascinating to read about. They were able to evade and survive the Iroquois onslaught of the 17th century, to absorb French traders and indigenous refugees over time, and because they also grew and harvested crops of every description. And all of this means that by the late 18th century, these prosperous Wabash communities were in command of the Ohio River Valley. And it's this fact that rankled both Kentucky settlers and American leaders like George Washington and Henry Knox, because they coveted these Indian lands. So these leaders and settlers went out and targeted Indian women, because they're the ones who worked the land and helped to make these villages so prosperous. They also targeted their children. They took these women and children hostage so that they could coerce the male Wabash warriors to come to the treaty table and cede their homelands. So this is one book that we'll definitely be reading at the Omohundro Institute. What books will you be reading this summer? We'd really love to know because we love to read. So please drop us a comment in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. It's free to join. Just text BFWorld to 33444 and click the link that I'll send you. Jenny, I wonder if you would tell us about Charleston's economy and how it evolved between the colonial and early republic periods. Because the economy was something that the merchants we've been discussing really had to work within. So I guess a good place for us to start would be, could you give us a description of Charleston's economy during the colonial period?
In the colonial period, Charleston is part of the mercantilist system. So the basic idea, the really one-sentence way to explain mercantilism is the country that ended up with the most gold at the end was the winner. So colonies had a role to play in this, and that they were supposed to buy manufactured goods from the mother country, to manufacture little in the colony, and to send produce that could not be obtained otherwise by the mother country back home. So what you see is these merchants were importing British manufactured goods and exporting rice and indigo. Indigo was important because it was otherwise a French product, and you didn't want to buy anything from France.
And how exactly did the economy change or evolve during the American Revolution?
The American Revolution is terrible for the economy. First of all, Charleston is occupied. It's defeated and taken over by the British. And they try to get things back up to speed, but they can't. The first reason they can't is because South Carolina decided to fund the revolution by printing as much paper money as possible. So basically, paper money is worth nothing, and that is confusing and ruining people left and right. The other issue is that its connections with the backcountry are basically destroyed. So they were hoping that, hey, we can just start shipping the rice again. Well, that didn't happen. So what you see during the revolution is the only people who are making money are the people who can import the desperately needed British manufactured goods. These are usually the guys at the bottom of the economic totem pole, and everybody is very unhappy about this whole thing. All the merchants are very unhappy that the wrong people are being successful.
You mentioned that in the colonial period, rice and indigo were really important export goods for South Carolina. And I wonder what happened to these export goods during the early Republic period. Because once the United States became an independent country, the economy changed. And so I wonder how specifically South Carolinians' ideas about the economy changed and how their economy changed during the early Republic.
So basically, after the Revolution, there is sort of a dead zone until the Constitution kicks in, as American finance kicks in, and merchants start getting to work. Afterwards, besides the financial things, there are basically three things that Charleston merchants make money in. One is the neutral trade with the Caribbean. Americans are allowed to export things to the Caribbean as long as there's a stop in America en route. And Charleston is in a great location for this. So the Caribbean, what they really want, is to have British manufactured goods imported there and to be able to export their own produce of the islands overseas. And because of all the restrictions on trade with the British, there's a ton of smuggling going on in Charleston. I can't give you exact numbers on all this because they're pretty secretive about it, but it appears, for example, British manufactured goods are being purchased in the German cities like Hamburg in exchange for rice and then brought to the Caribbean. So that's part of what they're doing, this sort of quasi-legal neutral trading. There's also the rise of the cotton trade after 1793. And one of the issues in the run-up to the War of 1812 is the people who want to buy the cotton are people they're not allowed to send cotton directly to. So they're not allowed to trade directly with England at sometimes, with France at other times. So what happens is Charleston merchants will, and they're really open about this, this is how I know, they will ship cotton to Amelia Island, which is technically Spanish, and it will be taken on neutral ships directly to England and France. So they are essentially trading with England and France. At times they're not supposed to be doing it, and they're pretty open about this. So those are sort of the funny trades they're engaged in. And the really awful one that's happening is South Carolina is the last state to make the international slave trade illegal. And there is a huge influx of people who are brought in by Charleston's merchants. In the last few years, it's legal. And even by the standards of this day, this is seen as an awful thing that's happening. But that is part of what makes up Charleston's trade in this era. The people who engage in this kind of trade, I was able to find out some things demographically. They're generally young men on the make. They seem to skew younger, and that there's an unusual number of them who are members of fire brigades, which is generally a young, rowdy men's game. If you read their letters, there are a lot of references to being drunk and how funny it is being drunk and how drunk you were last night. So there's a lot of sort of stuff like that going on. So that's the sort of people you see in Charleston after the Constitution, before the War of 1812, working as merchants.
I wonder if we could talk about the African slave trade a bit more, because David is really curious about South Carolina merchants' participation in it. He's also curious if there were other ways that middle-class men and women in Charleston may have exploited enslaved people to become middle class, or even just to retain their status as members of the middle class.
Yes, they were slave traders, and that includes Henry Lawrence, who I've mentioned before. It's also worth noting that the slave traders who were merchants tended to be people who had longer tenures in Charleston. They were wealthier than average. So being a slave trader was not something that you can say, oh, these are just outsiders coming into Charleston. It's the people who are most wealthy, successful, and committed to the town who are slave traders in Charleston. If you want to ask how the presence of slavery affects all of the middle class in Charleston, you can't be a merchant in Charleston without being engaged in some way in the slave system. Either you're selling goods to plantations or you're exporting the produce of plantations. There is no way around it. So I think one of the things that these questions really asking is, how are these people who seem like us in so many ways able to do such awful things? And I found a quote from one merchant named Zephaniah Kingsley, who kind of explained his worldview. And he said that there is no way to live a really good life. The world is kind of a tainted place. And this is the quote part. He said that his life was about balancing evils judiciously. And I think that explains a lot. When Henry Lawrence was asked to explain his participation in the slave trade by his son, who is actually kind of opposed to the whole thing, he said, well, it was there when I got here and I needed to support my family, even though I knew it was the wrong thing. So I think that's as good an explanation we're going to get.
Rosa wonders if middle-class early Americans ever feared that they might lose their status as, say, middle-class Britons during the colonial period and as middle-class Americans during the Revolutionary and early Republic periods. And she also wonders in this vein if there were any safety nets or fail-safes that might support a middle-class family who fell on hard times.
That's a good question. One of the ways that it's also alien to us is it's a world without a lot of support networks aside from your family and your friends. So if things went wrong, these are the people you turn to. And it has some interesting effects on the ways you interact with your family and your friends in the colonial world. I was struck by how unemotional letters within mercantile families were in the colonial period, that they often seem to just be very dry, very much about, oh, we have to do this, we have to do that. There are no outflowings of affection. Isabella Hamilton, who I mentioned earlier, I have many letters from her, and she never mentions, I love you or I miss you. So because the way you show affection in a family is you are stable, you are there, you support people in the family when things go wrong. The other proviso I have to say here is that this didn't mean that family members were going to be taken care of equally. For example, there were, within Isabella Hamilton's family, one of her aunts has no money, so they basically install her as a housekeeper at one of their properties. So that kind of inequality is part of it too. Friendship, on the other hand, you see very emotional connected letters between male merchants in the colonial period. There's a lot of sort of talking about the stresses of supporting a family, the duties of being a man, all these kind of things. They're really connecting with each other. And when things go wrong, they are often extremely generous with each other. I saw one man tell another, oh, if things go really sour, you can always just live with me. It's fine. Have a good heart. So there's this interesting emotionality to these relationships. They're not just providing financial support, they're also providing emotional support.
Jenny, you set out on a quest to find the origins of the American middle class. Do you think you found those origins? And if you did, is there anything about these origins that can tell us something about the American middle class today?
I think I did. And I think it sort of reveals why middle class can be such an expansive idea for us. And at the same time, the sort of flaws in the idea that are inherent in the original concept. I think being a useful member of society, focusing on your ability to work, to survive in the market economy, there's something appealing about being competent that I think explains why the idea of being middle class is able to expand this much. I think one of the issues is that because this definition intentionally at its root obscures wealth inequality, it's kind of blinded us to the way wealth inequality is creeping up on us as a society. And the last thing, because it's a self-definition, we haven't spent enough time thinking about the way people aren't allowed to consider themselves middle class. Because there are restrictions there are restrictions at the time, but the way this definition started out have sort of concealed them from us.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the American Revolution hadn't happened? How would the development of the American middle class have been different if the 13 colonies had remained a part of the British Empire?
I actually do have some thoughts, and these have to do with how middle class gets defined differently in other countries that were part of the Anglo-American Empire at the time. I picked up a book in the UK recently that was called The Middle Class ABC, and I was thinking, oh, this will be interesting. What do they think of middle class over there? What they seemed to mean as I read this book was that it was something more like pretentious, wealthy hipster. I recently saw a Guardian article that says middle class in the U.S. means what working class means in Britain. So to sort of answer your question, I think class means something different when you've got an aristocracy to measure yourself against. We may have ended up with something more like the British think about as middle class, which appears to be the caste above what we think of as middle class. Or we might have ended up with something more like Canada, where, and again, I am not certain on this, but they appear to be referring first to an economic definition. Middle class means, first of all, the people with middling income. And then if you press them on it, they will talk a little bit about the sort of consumer goods that are associated with middle class people. They seem to be, and again, I am not an expert on Canada, so Canadians can tell me I'm wrong. It seems to have less to do with we have these values and therefore we're awesome. It has more to do with these are the people who own these particular goods. So I think you can sort of get some suggestions of how the middle class would have been defined differently by looking at the UK and at Canada And I think it would not have been as central to national identity, and it would have meant something very different.
Jenny, now that you've explored the origins of the middle class and gotten to the bottom of it all, what are you working on now?
I am actually working on a novel right now, but I have been thinking about what the next history project was going to be. And because the period before the War of 1812 was so interesting economically, I've been thinking about ways to attack that. And I think a really interesting way to do it would be to look at the papers of Stephen Girard, who was a bigwig, really bigwig merchant in Philadelphia. And the reason I'd like to look at his papers is he had business everywhere. He'd have people sent to all corners of the Philadelphian trading world. And the first thing they do when they get there is they'd write him a little synopsis of what business was like wherever he had sent them. So it seems to me as sort of not so much about Girard himself, but a way to look at how this economic world worked would be to look at his papers. But that's something that's going to happen in the future. Right now, I'm working on a novel.
Would you like to tell us about your novel?
It's a funny novel about aliens, and it's in the really early stages, so hopefully it'll be done in a year or two.
If we have any lingering questions about Charleston, its merchants, and the early American middle class, how can we contact you with our questions?
I would love to answer more questions. I am currently a literary agent. Probably the best way to contact me is through my agency email. I'm at the Donald Moss Literary Agency, 2 A's, 2 S's, and you can look me up and click on the link there. I'm also on Twitter a lot. I'm Jenny Goloboy there, Jenny with an I-E. There are 3 O's in Goloboy, so would love to chat with people.
Jennifer Goloboy, thank you so much for taking us through early Charleston and the origins of the American middle class.
Thanks so much, Liz. This was great.
Being a useful member of society, focusing on our ability to work and survive in a market economy, being competent, not just in our jobs and areas of expertise, but in our ability to provide for the economic well-being of ourselves and our families. These are all appealing ideas, and they're all ideas we associate with American middle-class culture. They're also ideas that took shape and have roots in early American history. As Jenny revealed, it can be quite challenging to study middle-class culture and values in the context of early America. And one of the reasons it's so challenging is because the term middle class didn't emerge as a thing until the mid to late 19th century. Still, it's clear from Jenny's research that the people of British North America and the early United States really understood what it meant to be middle class. And at the heart of their definition was to be useful members of society, which meant to be useful in one's work. It meant being good enough at their jobs or profession that they could support themselves and their families in a way that was above just making it. Of course, for some early Americans, like Henry Lawrence, it meant doing your job well enough that you could become wealthy, that you could acquire some amount of cultural and political power in your community. Now, like many merchants in Charleston, Henry Lawrence acquired his wealth and political power by working in the slave trade. In fact, Lawrence was a slave trader. And when he wasn't working on his slave import business, he was managing his plantations, where enslaved people produced goods that he could sell for a profit overseas. It's these examples of men like Henry Lawrence, that make studying middle-class culture in early America particularly challenging for us. Because as Jenny noted, these men acquired great wealth by trading in human beings. Acts we can't even understand because they're so immoral and despicable. And yet we feel this way because when we look at these merchants, we really want them to be people just like us. Good people who wanted to promote a more egalitarian, just, and progressive society. And we want this because these are our middle-class values. But in the 18th and early 19th centuries, these weren't really aspects of middle-class culture. Neither was the idea of wealth. In early America, it was very possible for someone to be middle class and yet also be very rich. And I do mean very rich. Just look at Henry Lawrence. He always considered himself to be middle class, as did his fellow merchants. And yet, Lawrence owned multiple plantations with well over 200 enslaved men, women, and children on them. But this wealth didn't matter in terms of social class during the 18th century. British North America existed in a world of aristocracy, where men like Lawrence could own all the wealth in the world and yet never rise above middle class because of their birth and education. But today, many of us would balk at people who claim to be middle class and who also clearly live beyond the means of what we consider to be an average American lifestyle. And we balk because, for us, being middle class is also associated with wealth and income. So why do so many Americans today, who are not middle class, self-identify as members of the middle class? As Jenny revealed, it goes back to the culture's origins in early America. They want to be seen as useful members of society. Or, as Jenny so aptly put it, they want to be associated with Ben Franklin's world values. Look for more information about Jenny, her book, Charleston and the Emergence of Middle-Class Culture in the Revolutionary Era, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/190. Don't forget, we're meeting up in July, and you'll find details that you need for our Boston and Cleveland meetups on the show notes page. What are you reading this summer? I told you how at the Omohundro Institute, we're really excited to read our newest title, Susan Sleeper Smith's Indigenous Prosperity and American Conquest. But we'd love to know what you're reading. So please, help us flesh out our summer reading list by leaving us a comment in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. The community is a fun place to be, and I know this summer reading list is going to be a fun conversation to be a part of. So if you aren't already a member of the community, text BFWorld to 33444 and click the link that I'll send you. Finally, Jenny mentioned that one of the issues with our associating middle-class culture with being a useful member of society is that it obscures our ideas about wealth. And as a result, it can actually blind us to the ways that wealth inequality may be creeping up on our society. So if we had to change how we define what it means to be middle class, what do you think we should change that definition to? I'd love to know because this is a really interesting question, which means you'll have really interesting answers. So please, tell me what you think. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.